rights in light of this GBV crisis. And as we experienced earlier, as we're starting our conversation on Zoom, I made the mistake of sending this link and making it public. And unfortunately, we had unsavory activity on our Zoom discussion, and immediately had to abort it and start a private Zoom meeting because of that. And it's quite sad given our topic. So I'd like to open this by welcoming Dr. Zakeera. Doctor, if you could please just start off by explaining what you do in forensic languages, and then jumping on to the topic. And you can really start it from any angle. Please begin.
Thank you, Siki, and thank you, colleagues who managed to get in. And I think our apologies on behalf of ILAF that the previous Zoom was hacked. We had issues with Twitter, as Siki suggested earlier. That's why we opted to move to Zoom. So we do apologize, but as I was saying at the beginning, I think what we just saw with that content being shared, that graphic content, how readily available it is on social media platforms and on the internet. And it really forms part in itself of forensic linguistics, which is my area of expertise. It's something new as well that colleagues in the UK at Forensic Linguistics Unit at Aston are looking at in terms of cybercrime and porn falling under that. So it's quite serious, and I think we've just all seen it today as well. So my sincere apologies for that. Siki, I know you wanted to have a discussion about emojis and how that forms part of gender-based violence and so forth, but I also know that what prompted you to want to have this conversation is what's happening in the Western Cape currently, where we see the new language policy being taken by the police to say that English now will be the sole official language for all statement taking in all police stations across the Western Cape. And I think, that's really our central focus point for this discussion, especially on the back of Human Rights Day tomorrow, to say how does this implicate onto our language rights, and how does this affect gender-based violence victims and the crisis that we're currently experiencing in South Africa? I don't think I answered your question. I think I just waffled on. I think you wanted me to say what I'm currently doing. I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of the Western Cape, and I'm housed in the Department of African Language Studies. And the focus of my research is forensic linguistics, focusing specifically on language rights and language usage in courtroom discourse beyond the borders of South Africa as well. And it's nice to see colleagues tuned in here. So thank you very much, Siki, for the welcome.
Thank you very much. You have written an article that's yet to be published, but you also looked into the language rights and in the context of our crisis with GBV and what it means. And I know that you've just mentioned also, the Western Cape that released that article about SAPC and SAPS and the use of the English language, that it's the official recording language on police station. And how will this affect South Africans? Why should South Africans care about this? And what is the right approach to deal with this? Because does SAPS even care about such details? Do they have the capacity to deal with language? Because it seems as if there's a capacity issue that SAPS is facing on all fronts. Not to add any more questions, but also I'm just thinking, there is also financial implications, and there are also job opportunities that really should be added for something like language, because there are huge legal implications from what I can tell, as somebody who's not a legal expert, who's just a citizen. So please kick us off before I add any more issues.
Let me see if I can remember the first issue. You know, when we look at this, the SAP's language policy, and for colleagues who don't know, I think it was last weekend, and I think Dr. Steenkamp will correct me if I have the facts wrong, but last weekend we woke up to reports on the front pages of Afrikaans newspapers informing us that a decision had now been taken by the Western Cape Police Commissioner Tembisile Patekile to say English is now the sole language in which A1 statements will be taken at police stations. No statements in languages other than English will be accepted by police officers to form part of dockets, as was the case. And this issue, Siki, arose from an internal discussion within the police station where a docket was produced, or a dossier, as they called it in the newspaper, to say that it was produced in Afrikaans and the statements were written in Afrikaans in an area that the majority of the people surrounding this police station speak Afrikaans as a mother tongue. Let me just point that out as well. And
since you know, the legacy issues with Credit Suisse, and you can see that.
And what happened there is it was then sent on, and the commissioner then said, no, we cannot accept this any longer because our language of record, as we know, is English only in courts. And if we trace it back all the way to that language of record policy in 2017 that the former Chief Justice Mogoeng took in conjunction with the heads of court to say English is now the sole official language of record. Colleagues and I said at the time, and I think we are joined by many of those colleagues today, including Dr. Annelies de Vries, who wrote that open letter in the City Press, and we said, this is going to have grave implications for the South African Police Service. And you are going to see a trickle-down effect where people's language rights are going to start to be constrained. And those constitutional provisions that we have, and I think you'll get into that, Siki, will slowly be watered down, and we will move towards this hegemonic position of English only to the exclusion of the majority of our people. And that's exactly what's happening. So we're now saying the situation is you will enter a police station in the Western Cape where the majority of the people, and this is a statistical fact, this is not something I or colleagues thought up overnight, the majority speak Afrikaans or isiXhosa, then followed by English in that order in the Western Cape, and say, when I enter a police station, regardless of my linguistic capabilities, I am now to give my statement in English. That's how we understood it. We read further then from this article and what the police commissioner had said, and based on what his spokesperson had also said in providing clarity, well, I'm sorry to be harsh and critical. I don't think she provided clarity. I think she confused the whole issue further. Because she said, no, you can walk into a police station, Siki, and you can give your statement in any of the 11 official languages, but the police officer is recording it in English, okay? And we know this has been happening in any case across police stations across the country. But what we are essentially saying is, and we want to draw a connection now, the GBV crisis that is out of control. And when you look at the crime statistics in the Western Cape as well, in terms of gang-related offenses and how that influences GBV incidents. A GBV complainant is walking into a police station, can only speak Afrikaans or isiXhosa, has limited linguistic competency or no linguistic competency in English, is communicating now with the police officer, who in all probability speaks the same language as the complainant. So the police officer is sitting there in the charge office, listening to the complainant's narrative, but recording it by hand on paper in English. So essentially, we are saying now that the police officer is an interpreter, he's a translator. So he's actually, or she's actually a transporter. That's what we are calling it in forensic linguistics. And yet this police officer doesn't have any linguistic capabilities. It's the most bizarre scenario that we have heard of. And I think what has infuriated us as language activists, as forensic linguists in the country, is that the decision, when it was taken by the Western Cape Police Commissioner besides it being uninformed and ill-informed, what was said by the spokesperson later to say, I acknowledge that the police officer doesn't have linguistic training. I mean, just listen to this rationale and thinking. But the police officer must do his or her best to translate and interpret word for word without any meaning loss. Now, we know from a point of language and translation studies that means simultaneous translation. Now, as a mother tongue speaker of English, as a second language speaker of isiXhosa, I mean, I would find that difficult to do myself without proper training and being a qualified interpreter. And I think regardless of who the interpreter is, I mean, if you talk to skilled court interpreters, you will find out that exact same issue, because they'll say, you know, that it's so hard, even in court, to do simultaneous interpretation. It requires such a skill, and that is only a few people are able to do it. Now, how do we expect this police officer to do it, Siki? Now, how does this GBV crisis tie in? Okay, so the police officer is transferring word for word into another language, into the target language, which is English. How are you in an area where slang is spoken and there are euphemisms used? And we know, Siki, in African culture, it's taboo to talk about rape. It's taboo to talk about your sexual organs or any sexual acts. So the police officer is understanding that cultural dynamic that is associated with language. But the police officer is also in a predicament now, trying to follow this directive given by his commissioner to say, no, you must translate or interpret word for word. How do you do that, Siki? And you know, Siki, it takes me back, and I think you were in part of this conversation last year, the legal linguistics workshop that we hosted with the Austrian colleagues.
Yes, I was thinking of that, in fact.
Yes, and you will recall, maybe we should just refresh it for colleagues who were not able to join then. We had senior court intermediaries, Aldine Jooster and Mrs. Fiona van Wyk joining us from the NPA, and who are practicing intermediaries with an excess of 25 years experience working in the Western Cape courts, dealing with GBV crisis complainants on a daily basis. And you'll remember, Siki, that they came there and they shared examples in which child victims and other vulnerable witnesses use specific vocabulary that was specific to an area in the Western Cape. And those were words that we just never heard of. And I actually jotted them down, if I may share, Siki. And this is not my own research. This is Mrs. van Wyk's research and that of the intermediaries. I mean, in the Western Cape, for instance, Fiona and Aldine were saying that isiXhosa and Afrikaans were just so closely related. They were looking at terminologies like vana, and I was thinking, what is that, you know? And I immediately thought siyavana for isiXhosa, obviously.
Yeah.
And it was exactly that, because they were explaining that it's derived from the isiXhosa. And they are now using that stem or that term in Afrikaans in a specific area. Fadala, old, run down, beaten up, drunk. You know, this is specific terminology. And in terms of the GBV crisis, the intermediary shared very specific terminology and said, for instance, when we look at isiXhosa, we will know, Siki, that isiXhosa sithi umphambili, and we don't say the sexual organs, okay? We use that umphambili. Now, for the Afrikaans speakers in these areas in which the intermediaries have done their research, they were referring to sex or rape as onderwets, ogat, oudertrots, or oulikmaak, which a child would use. Now, I'm just thinking, when that person, that complainant, walks in and uses that terminology, so how is the police officer going to transfer meaning? And I mean, people might say I'm being absolutely silly and ridiculous, but you're saying word for word. If the police officer then goes and says that there was a sexual act performed, or if it was rape, when we get to court, that child witness or that complainant is not going to use the term rape or say I was sexually molested in any way. They are going to use these terms that I've just listed. And then there's going to be a dispute with that written statement, which we know, and the oral evidence, which is now being provided from the complainant. And then we have all sorts of issues about credibility and witness credibility. And I think this is why I'm saying it's an ill-informed, top-down approach policy that has such far-reaching implications for ordinary citizens such as ourselves, that is not well thought out at all by the Western Cape Police Commissioner. And even, you know, when we talk about umphambili, then in isiXhosa, for child victims, Fiona and Aldine were saying they are using a terminology for the vagina to say verkeerde plek, the wrong place. Again, word for word translation, we're looking at simultaneous translation. And I think it boils down to policies being uninformed from a language perspective. And this is highly concerning, Siki.
Absolutely, and thank you for that. And during your article, you mentioned an example that I thought was, you know, equally important in how problematic this English policy is. When one of the victims from who was testifying at that rape is it Zondo or
Cheryl Zondi in the
Omotoso. Yes, in the Omotoso case, where the police officer had written one thing about, you know, had one report that was written, and her testimony in court was different, and it was not her who wrote it down. It was a police officer, and the two statements were different. So I'd like you to comment on that and just the implications of the language and the language of record that gets used by policemen versus the language of the complainant.
No, I think that's a really good example, Siki, because I mean, you know, that Omotoso case was so widely publicized, and I think that's where a lot of us could actually see the implications of the monolingual language of record policy. But I mean, you know, Cheryl Zondi had linguistic capabilities in English and could speak English at mother tongue competency. So fortunately, that worked in her favor. But as you suggest, I mean, when she provided that statement to the police officer, based on her oral evidence, she said she was so traumatized at the time that she didn't take the time to read what the police officer had recorded in the statement, okay, based on her oral narrative. And she just merely signed it. Now,
sure,
you know, that's obviously going to happen now with everybody. We all have to do that. But more than 89% of our population don't speak English as a mother tongue, okay? So you are now putting your signature, affirming your signature to that statement, verifying the facts that are written in there, but you have no idea what is written in there. So how do you affirm your signature to that? I'm not quite sure what the police expect. You are relying on a police officer, Siki, to be able to really retell your story, to create your story. And I think, you know, it's unfair of me or any of us to blame the police officers, because they themselves are caught in the system, this English only policy system that says you have this responsibility now, whether they like it or not. And as much as we'd like to criticize them, is it really their fault? Because the system is broken. The policies are to blame, not the police officers. And that's what we need to understand and rectify. We can't have police commissioners and spokespersons commenting publicly on national forums and saying in the media, oh, he or she can do it word for word, even though they don't have linguistic training. I mean, these are reckless statements. They besides being negligent, like I said, they're ill-informed. And it goes to show as well, and again, I'm very harsh in my criticism, but I have to be, to say that if a spokesperson who you'd expect to understand linguistic issues is making silly comments, because that's what it was, silly comments in the media to say about word for word translation and interpretation, and that it doesn't matter if he or she doesn't have linguistic competencies, you can go and ask for help. I think we must mention that too, Siki. That was mentioned in the article. And again, we're wondering from a point of academia, what does she mean by help? I'm not quite sure. We are seeking clarity on that, and we have yet to have an answer. And when you refer to help, we assume the help of an interpreter. Now, if we get into the nitty-gritty, and I don't want to do that today because I don't want to bore people, if we look specifically at policies and the police policies and the legislation, it says there that interpreters may be available at police stations. So I assume that is what she's referring to. It then says Section 7 of the police policy, which, by the way, is not enacted yet, it's still in draft form, says we're subject to budgetary constraints. Now, can somebody please show me or tell me where there's a police station in South Africa where an interpreter is sitting ready to translate into the 11 official languages? Or if I'm here in the Eastern Cape or the Western Cape, into isiXhosa, Afrikaans, or Sesotho. I'm not quite sure. I don't understand that reasoning. It baffles me. There is no way in which a complainant is going to walk into a police station and the police officer is going to say, oh, excuse me, ma'am, please can you wait? I will go and call an interpreter to assist us. Where is the interpreter? And again, it boils down to the same. It's almost like I'm stuck on record and a repeat to say it boils down to that language of record issue, that policy, that problematic policy. Because if we didn't have that policy and we took a bilingual or a multilingual approach within specific provinces, I'm not saying everybody should speak 11 official languages. I don't think any of us on the platform are able to do that either. That's silly. But what I'm saying is within provinces, if we kept that policy, that bilingual policy of English and Afrikaans, and then added the indigenous languages to form that multilingual approach. So we say in the Western Cape, isiXhosa is a majority spoken language. In the Eastern Cape, isiXhosa is a majority spoken language. When you get to Gauteng, it obviously gets more complicated, and you're looking at your Setswana and your other languages that fall outside the Nguni group. Then it becomes more complicated. But if you're looking at your Chavenda speakers in Limpopo or so forth, it's a bit more, it's easier. And I think that also contributes not only to ensuring people have access to justice in their mother tongue, but that your first port of call to the criminal justice system, which is your police, is accessible to you. And I think that is very important. That's what we need to try and do. I'm not saying, you asked me about what is the best way forward. We don't have the answers, okay? We are trying to research what the problems are, and these are the problems that we are coming up with. And we are saying collectively to the police, tell us internally what your difficulties are. Because we're not naive in thinking that there are no practical difficulties to using languages other than English. But these are challenges that can be addressed. There were pilot projects that were run in the Eastern Cape and that were just simply shut down in court. And we wanted to know why they didn't succeed. And we were met, obviously, from the Judge President's office to say, it didn't work. That's the end of the story, but no reasons given. And I'm sorry, that is unacceptable. You cannot say that something doesn't work and then just leave it. And I think in South Africa, if we revert to the late Neville Alexander's arguments, which is 20 and 30 years ago, to say South Africa is on this policy bandwagon, and all we do is create more and more policies and legislation, but we're not fixing the problem. Why is the policy failing? Why is the legislation failing? That is what we need to address. And when you have experts within the field, like your intermediaries, like your interpreters, like your police officers, who are then able to come together with us as forensic linguists and say, these are the problems, how do we fix it? And we have made this plea, and I think you are aware of it, Siki, to the legal fraternity, but who are we? We are currently now working with, I must add, with the Department of Justice, but also to the police to say, let us help you. We have ideas. We need to hear internally what the issues are so we can address them from a point of theory and you can apply it from a point of practice. And then we see how we go from there.